He stood there with his paper plate watching families laugh around picnic tables that seemed to have no room for him. The annual Riverside Community BBQ was in full swing, and Harold Martinez had made the mistake of thinking he belonged. At US 78, his weathered hands trembled slightly as he held his plate of lukewarm potato salad and a single burger that had been sitting under the heat lamps too long. No one had offered him a seat. No one had even made eye contact. The younger, families clustered around their own tables, children running between legs, parents sharing stories about soccer games and school projects. The middle-aged crowd dominated the prime seating near the pavilion, their conversations flowing over business deals and vacation plans. And Harold? Harold stood like a ghost at his own community's gathering, invisible despite being right there, in plain sight. "Excuse me," he said softly to a woman arranging condiments on a nearby table. She glanced up briefly, her eyes sliding past him as if he were part of the furniture. She turned back to her task without a word. Harold cleared his throat and tried again. "Is there somewhere I might sit?" The woman looked annoyed at the interruption. "The tables are pretty full," she said curtly, not bothering to look around or offer alternatives. "Maybe try over there." She waved vaguely toward the back corner where a few folding chairs sat empty near the dumpster. Harold nodded politely and shuffled toward the suggested spot. His worn sneakers scuffed against the concrete as he walked past table after table of people who seemed to look right through him. If you believe our elders deserve basic dignity and respect, hit that like button right now, because what you're about to witness will change how you see the quiet heroes walking among us. The corner, by the dumpster, smelled of rotting food and cleaning chemicals. Harold sat down heavily in one of the unstable folding chairs, his knees creaking audibly. From here, he could watch the festivities like a spectator at his own community's life. Children squealed with delight at the bounce house. Teenagers clustered around the dessert table, sneaking extra cookies. Adults mingled with drinks in hand, their laughter carrying across the parking lot. But no one came to check on the old man eating alone by the garbage. Harold had lived in Riverside for 43 years. He'd bought his small house on Maple Street back in 1981, when the neighborhood was just starting to develop. He'd watched these streets fill with families, had seen children grow up and move away, had witnessed the community grow from a handful of houses into a thriving suburb. Yet sitting here now, he felt like a stranger in his own hometown. A group of men his age were gathered around the grill, but they were the neighborhood's success stories. Retired executives, former small business owners, men who'd built comfortable retirements and maintained their social circles. Harold had tried to join their conversations before, but somehow the talk always turned to golf courses he couldn't afford or investment strategies that were beyond his reach. They weren't mean to him exactly. They just had nothing in common with a man who'd spent most of his working years doing maintenance at the local factory. The irony wasn't lost on him. These men talked about their glory days in corporate boardrooms, their business victories, their financial achievements. They wore polo shirts with country club logos and drove cars that cost more than Harold's annual Social Security income. They were respected, valued, included, but they had no idea who they were ignoring. Harold finished his burger in silence, watching a young father teach his son to throw a football. The boy couldn't have been more than 8, all knobby knees and excitement, running back and forth, as his dad patiently corrected his grip. It was a scene that should have brought Harold joy, but instead it highlighted his isolation. When had he become so invisible? When had his community decided he no longer mattered? A woman walked by carrying a trash bag, clearly part of the cleanup crew. She paused near Harold's chair, and for a moment he thought she might speak to him. Instead, she grabbed the overflowing garbage can next to his table and wheeled it away without so much as acknowledging his presence. Harold might as well have been another piece of discarded furniture. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and Harold's water bottle had been empty for over an hour. He considered getting up to find the drink station, but the thought of navigating through more crowds of people who would look right through him felt exhausting. Instead, he sat quietly, his eyes taking in every detail of the community that had forgotten him. Near the main pavilion, a group of women were organizing some kind of raffle. Their voices carried across the lot as they laughed and chatted, their energy infectious. Harold remembered when his late wife Maria would have been right there with them, helping with community events, bringing people together. Maria had been the social one, the bridge between Harold and the neighborhood. Since her death 3 years ago, those bridges had crumbled, leaving Harold marooned on his own island of solitude. The children's laughter grew louder as the afternoon wore on, but it only emphasized Harold's silence. He watched a little girl drop her ice cream cone and immediately start crying. Within seconds, 3 adults had rushed to comfort her. Someone produced napkins, and another child offered to share their treat. The community's capacity for care was evident everywhere. Just not for him. Harold's hands, spotted with age and marked by decades of honest work, rested on his knees as he observed the social dynamics playing out before him. Every group had its invisible boundaries, its unspoken membership requirements. The young families bonded over parenting challenges and school district concerns. The successful retirees shared stories of travel and leisure. The middle-aged professionals networked and planned neighborhood improvements. And where did that leave Harold Martinez? A man whose uniform had once commanded respect, whose service had earned medals, whose sacrifices had protected the very freedom these families enjoyed at their weekend barbecues. But they had no idea who they were ignoring. As the sun began to sink lower in the sky, Harold noticed people starting to pack up. Coolers were loaded back into SUVs, folding chairs collapsed and stowed away. The community BBQ was winding down, and Harold realized he hadn't spoken to a single person beyond his brief, unsuccessful attempt to find a proper seat. He stood slowly, his joints stiff from sitting in the uncomfortable chair for hours. His paper plate went into the trash can, and he began the short walk back to his house on Maple Street. Behind him, the sounds of the barbecue continued to fade as families said their goodbyes and made plans for next weekend's activities. Harold's small house came into view, its modest front porch decorated with a single American flag that he raised and lowered with military precision every single day. The flag was one of the few things that connected him to who he used to be, before age and circumstances had rendered him invisible to his own community. As he climbed the 3 steps to his front door, Harold could still hear the distant sounds of laughter and conversation from the barbecue. Somewhere in that crowd, people were making connections, sharing stories, building relationships. And somewhere in that same crowd, no one had noticed that one of their neighbors had spent the entire afternoon sitting alone by the garbage, forgotten and ignored. Harold turned his key in the lock and stepped inside his quiet house. But what happened next would leave the entire town speechless, because sometimes the people we overlook are the very ones who've sacrificed everything for our freedom to gather, to celebrate, and to ignore the heroes hiding in plain sight. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the community barbecue. Harold was watering the small garden behind his house when he heard the persistent ringing from inside. By the time he made it to the kitchen, slightly out of breath, he almost missed the call entirely. "Mr. Martinez?" The voice was professional, formal. "This is Jennifer Walsh from the Riverside Historical Society. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." Harold dried his hands on a dish towel, puzzled. He'd never had any contact with the Historical Society before. "No, this is fine. How can I help you?" "Well, actually, we're hoping we can help you. We're planning the dedication ceremony for our new Veterans Memorial, and we've been researching local veterans for the project. Your name came up in our records, and we'd love to speak with you about your service." Harold sank slowly into his kitchen chair. The memorial project had been in the works for over 2 years, funded by donations and a small city grant. He'd read about it in the local paper, but never imagined he'd be contacted. "I'm not sure what you'd want to know," he said quietly. "Everything," Jennifer replied with genuine enthusiasm. "We want to make sure we honor all our local veterans properly. Would you be available to meet this week? We could come to you if that's more convenient." That afternoon, Harold found himself sitting across from Jennifer Walsh and 2 other Historical Society members in his small living room. They'd brought notebooks, a recorder, and an energy that Harold hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in decades, people were genuinely interested in his story. "Let's start with when you enlisted," Jennifer said, her pen poised over her notepad. Harold's weathered hands folded in his lap. It was 1965. I was 19, fresh out of high school. The war in Vietnam was escalating, and I knew I'd probably be drafted anyway. Figured it was better to volunteer, have some choice in how I served. The questions came slowly at first, then with increasing urgency as the researchers realized what they'd stumbled upon. Harold's service record wasn't just impressive, it was extraordinary. 2 Purple Hearts, a Silver Star, a Bronze Star with V for valor. Citations for heroism under fire, for saving wounded comrades, for acts of courage that most people couldn't imagine. Mr. Martinez, Jennifer said, her voice barely above a whisper, do you realize that you're one of the most decorated veterans in our entire county? Harold shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. I just did my job. We all did. But as the interview continued, it became clear that Harold Martinez had done far more than just his job. The records they'd uncovered painted a picture of a young soldier who'd repeatedly risked his life for others, who'd shown extraordinary courage in the face of impossible odds, who'd embodied everything noble about military service. The Silver Star citation was particularly striking. Harold had single-handedly held off an enemy advance while his wounded squad members were evacuated, staying behind to provide cover fire even after taking shrapnel in his shoulder and leg. When ammunition ran low, he'd used his own body as a shield to protect a critically wounded teenager until help arrived. Why didn't you ever mention any of this? Jennifer asked. These are incredible achievements. The community should know about this. Harold looked out his window toward the house where the barbecue had been held. Who would want to hear it? I'm just an old man who worked maintenance for 30 years and lives alone. People have their own lives, their own problems. The historical society team exchanged glances. They were beginning to understand that they'd discovered not just a decorated veteran, but a forgotten hero living invisibly among them. Over the following days, Jennifer and her team dove deeper into Harold's military records. What they found was even more remarkable than they'd initially discovered. Harold Martinez wasn't just a decorated veteran. He was a genuine war hero whose actions had saved dozens of lives and changed the course of multiple engagements. The Bronze Star had been awarded for Harold's actions during a particularly brutal firefight where his unit was pinned down by heavy enemy fire. Despite being wounded himself, Harold had crawled across open ground under intense fire to reach 2 wounded soldiers who were trapped in an exposed position. He'd dragged them both to safety, then returned with medical supplies to treat their wounds while bullets flew overhead. But it was the circumstances surrounding his Purple Hearts that truly revealed Harold's character. The first had come from shrapnel wounds sustained while he was rescuing wounded Vietnamese civilians from a bombed village, despite having no orders to do so. The second came from injuries sustained during his Silver Star action, when he'd chosen to stay behind and cover his squad's retreat, even though he'd already been hit twice. Jennifer Walsh had been researching military history for over 15 years, but she'd never encountered a service record quite like Harold's. More importantly, she'd never encountered a hero who seemed so completely unaware of his own heroism. The memorial dedication is in 2 weeks, she told Harold during their final interview. We'd be honored if you'd be our keynote speaker. Harold shook his head immediately. I don't speak in public. Never have. There are other veterans more qualified, more comfortable with that kind of thing. Mr. Martinez, Jennifer said gently, you don't understand. This memorial isn't just about honoring veterans in general. We've decided to design it around the stories of our local heroes. Your story is going to be the centerpiece. Harold's eyes widened. I don't understand, Jennifer smiled. The monument is going to feature bronze relief panels depicting acts of heroism by local veterans. The central panel is going to show your Silver Star action. Your face, your story, your heroism is going to be the face of our community's tribute to military service. The color drained from Harold's face. You can't do that. I'm nobody special. I'm just, you're a hero, Jennifer interrupted. Whether you believe it or not, whether you're comfortable with it or not, you're a genuine American hero, and it's time this community knew it. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur for Harold. Word had somehow gotten out about the memorial's centerpiece. And suddenly his phone was ringing constantly. Reporters wanted interviews. Veterans organizations wanted to honor him. Neighbors who hadn't spoken to him in years were suddenly stopping by with casseroles and conversation. Harold found the attention overwhelming and uncomfortable. He'd spent the last 3 years, really the last several decades, living quietly and invisibly. The idea that his face would be permanently displayed on a public monument filled him with anxiety rather than pride. The night before the dedication ceremony, Harold sat on his front porch, looking out at the street where he'd lived for over 4 decades. Cars he didn't recognize were parked along the curb. People he'd never met had been knocking on his door all week. Everything about his quiet, invisible life was changing, and he wasn't sure how he felt about it. But what happened next would leave the entire town speechless, because sometimes the moment when a community discovers its hidden heroes becomes the moment when that community discovers its own shame. The day of the memorial dedication dawned bright and clear, with temperatures perfect for an outdoor ceremony. Harold had barely slept, his stomach churning with anxiety about the attention he was about to receive. He'd laid out his only suit, a navy blue outfit he'd worn to Maria's funeral 3 years earlier, and tried to prepare himself for what Jennifer Walsh had promised would be a small, dignified ceremony. By 9 in the morning, Harold could see from his front window that small had been a significant underestimate. Cars were already lining Riverside's main street, and people were walking toward the new memorial site carrying folding chairs and small American flags. The local news van was setting up equipment near the monument, and Harold could see uniformed members from the local VFW post directing traffic. Harold's hands shook as he attempted to knot his tie. He hadn't worn formal clothes in years, and the simple task felt overwhelming. Everything about this day felt overwhelming. For decades, he'd lived contentedly in the shadows, requiring nothing from his community except to be left alone. Now, he was about to become the center of attention for that same community, whether he wanted it or not. A knock at his front door interrupted his preparations. Harold opened it to find Jennifer Walsh dressed in a professional blue dress and carrying a small bouquet of flowers. "Good morning, Mr. Martinez," she said warmly. "I thought you might like some company walking over to the ceremony." Harold nodded gratefully. The idea of facing the crowd alone had been terrifying him since he'd woken up. "Thank you. I have to admit, I'm pretty nervous about all this." Jennifer's smile was understanding. "That's completely normal. But I want you to know that what we're doing today is important, not just for you, but for everyone who will see this memorial. Stories like yours need to be told." They walked together down Maple Street toward the memorial site, and Harold was amazed by the number of people already gathered. The small, dignified ceremony had apparently grown into a major community event. He recognized some faces from the neighborhood, but many were strangers, drawn by the media coverage or word of mouth about the decorated veteran who'd been living quietly among them. As they approached the memorial site, Harold could see the covered monument for the first time. It was larger than he'd expected, constructed of black granite with bronze relief panels just as Jennifer had described. The central panel was still covered by a white cloth waiting for the official unveiling. "There he is!" someone called out, and Harold felt his face flush as heads turned in his direction. A small group of uniformed veterans approached, led by a man about Harold's age wearing a VFW cap covered in military pins. "Mr. Martinez," the man said, extending his hand. "I'm Robert Chen, commander of VFW Post 847. We're honored to meet you, sir." Truly honored. More veterans gathered around Harold, shaking his hand, expressing their respect for his service. Harold was overwhelmed by their warmth and genuine admiration. These were men and women who understood military service, who recognized the significance of his decorations, who saw him as a peer rather than an invisible old man. "We had no idea," Robert Chen said, shaking his head. "A Silver Star recipient, living right here in our community, and we had no idea. That's on us, sir. That's our failure." Harold was about to respond when he noticed a familiar group approaching from the parking area. It was several families from the community barbecue, including the woman who'd dismissed him when he'd asked for a place to sit. They looked uncomfortable, uncertain, as if they weren't sure whether they should approach or keep their distance. "Harold?" The voice belonged to Tom Richardson, one of the successful retirees who'd been part of the exclusive group around the grill. "I don't know if you remember me. We've lived in the same neighborhood for years." Harold nodded politely. "I remember." Tom's face was flushed with what appeared to be embarrassment. "I wanted to apologize. We should have gotten to know you better. Should have included you more in neighborhood activities." The woman who directed Harold to sit by the dumpster appeared at Tom's shoulder. Her name was Carol Stevens, Harold remembered now, and she looked mortified. "Mr. Martinez, I am so sorry about the barbecue. I had no idea who you were, what you'd done for our country. That's no excuse for how I treated you, but I want you to know how ashamed I am." Harold felt a familiar discomfort rising in his chest. "It's fine, you don't need to apologize." "Yes, we do," Tom said firmly. "We absolutely do need to apologize. You're a hero, and we treated you like you were nobody." "I am nobody," Harold said quietly. "I'm just an old man who did his job a long time ago." Jennifer Walsh stepped forward, having overheard the conversation. "Mr. Martinez, you need to stop saying that. You need to understand what you accomplished, what you sacrificed. These people need to understand it too." The memorial dedication ceremony officially began at 10 o'clock, with over 300 people in attendance. Harold found himself seated in the front row, surrounded by local dignitaries, military officials, and fellow veterans. The crowd stretched back across the memorial park, with some people standing on the surrounding sidewalks to get a better view. Mayor Patricia Williams served as the master of ceremonies, and her opening remarks focused on the importance of recognizing and honoring the veterans who lived among them. "Today," she said, "we're not just dedicating a memorial to all veterans. We're specifically honoring the extraordinary heroism of one of our own neighbors, a man who has lived quietly in our community for over 4 decades while carrying the distinguished service record of a genuine American hero." Harold shifted uncomfortably in his seat as the mayor continued. Harold Martinez enlisted in the United States Army in 1965 and served with extraordinary distinction in Vietnam. His decorations include 2 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star with V device for valor, and a Silver Star, our nation's 3rd highest decoration for combat heroism. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Many people were hearing these details for the first time, and Harold could see the shock and recognition on faces throughout the audience. These were his neighbors, people who'd lived near him for years, who'd walked past his house countless times, who'd seen him at community events and grocery stores without ever imagining his remarkable background. Colonel James Harrison, representing the Regional Army Command, stepped forward to address the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've had the privilege of reading Mr. Martinez's complete service record, and I want you to understand exactly what kind of man has been living among you." The Colonel began reading from Harold's Silver Star citation, his voice carrying clearly across the memorial park. "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against the enemy while serving as a squad leader with Company B, 1st Battalion, 506th Infantry Regiment. When his unit came under intense enemy fire resulting in numerous casualties, Sergeant Martinez voluntarily remained in an exposed position to provide covering fire for the evacuation of wounded personnel." Harold closed his eyes, trying to block out the memories that the citation brought flooding back. The heat, the noise, the fear, the weight of responsibility for the young soldiers under his command. Most of all, the face of Private Danny Morrison, barely 18 years old, who'd been bleeding out in that exposed position when Harold made the decision to stay behind. Despite being wounded twice by enemy fire, the colonel continued, Sergeant Martinez maintained his defensive position for over 2 hours, single-handedly holding off repeated enemy assaults until reinforcements could arrive. His actions directly saved the lives of 7 wounded soldiers and prevented the overrun of a critical defensive position. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Harold could feel hundreds of eyes on him, but he kept his own eyes fixed on his hands, folded in his lap. "The Bronze Star citation is equally remarkable," Colonel Harrison continued. "Sergeant Martinez repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire to rescue wounded soldiers, carrying them to safety across open ground while under intense combat conditions. On one occasion, he crawled over 200 meters through enemy territory to reach two critically wounded soldiers, then carried them both to safety in separate trips, refusing medical attention for his own wounds until all casualties had been evacuated. Harold heard someone in the crowd whisper, "My God," and he felt his face burning with embarrassment. This wasn't how he wanted to be remembered. This wasn't how he wanted his neighbors to see him. But Colonel Harrison wasn't finished. What makes Mr. Martinez's service even more remarkable is what happened after he returned from combat. Despite his distinguished record and the option to pursue a military career, he chose to come home, to live quietly, to serve his community in different ways. He worked for 30 years in maintenance, supporting his family, contributing to his neighborhood, never seeking recognition or special treatment. The colonel paused, looking directly at Harold. Mr. Martinez represents the very best of American military service, not just the heroism under fire, but the humility and continued service that followed. He embodies the warrior who becomes a quiet citizen, the hero who returns to civilian life without fanfare or expectation of recognition. Jennifer Walsh stepped forward to begin the official unveiling of the memorial. This monument represents our community's commitment to never forget the sacrifices made on our behalf, she said. The central panel depicts the Silver Star action of Harold Martinez, but it represents all the quiet heroes who live among us, the veterans whose service we too often take for granted. As the white cloth fell away from the bronze relief panel, a collective gasp rose from the crowd. The artist had created a powerful scene showing Harold's defensive action, with incredible attention to detail and emotional impact, but it was the face of the soldier in the relief that struck everyone most powerfully. It was unmistakably Harold, captured at the moment of his greatest heroism, bronze features strong and determined, but the silence that followed would haunt them forever, because seeing their neighbor's face immortalized in bronze forced everyone to confront an uncomfortable truth about how they'd treated a genuine American hero. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. Harold stared at the bronze relief panel, seeing his own face rendered in metal, frozen at the moment when he'd made the decision to stay behind and cover his squad's retreat. The artist had captured something in that bronze face that Harold didn't recognize in himself, something noble and determined and utterly fearless. Around him, 300 people were processing the same shocking realization. This was their neighbor, the quiet old man who lived on Maple Street, who they'd ignored at community events, who'd been sitting alone by the garbage at their barbecue just 3 weeks earlier. This decorated war hero with his face now permanently displayed as the centerpiece of their memorial was the same person they'd rendered invisible. Harold could see the recognition dawning on face after face throughout the crowd. Tom Richardson looked like he'd been physically struck. Carol Stevens had tears streaming down her cheeks. The successful retirees who'd excluded him from their conversations were staring at the memorial with expressions of horror and shame. Mayor Williams stepped back to the microphone, her own voice slightly shaky. "I think we're all processing some difficult realizations today," she said carefully. "This memorial serves not just as a tribute to our veterans, but as a reminder that heroism often walks among us unrecognized." A voice from the crowd called out, "We should have known." It was followed by murmurs of agreement, people expressing shame and regret for their treatment of Harold over the years. Harold stood slowly, his legs unsteady. He hadn't planned to speak, had specifically declined Jennifer's invitation to address the crowd, but something about this moment demanded a response from him. "May I say something?" he asked quietly. Mayor Williams immediately stepped aside, offering him the microphone. Harold approached it hesitantly, his hands visibly shaking as he gripped the stand. "I want you all to know," he began, his voice barely audible, then cleared his throat and tried again. "I want you all to know that you don't owe me anything. Not apologies, not recognition, not special treatment." The crowd remained completely silent, straining to hear every word. What happened in Vietnam was a long time ago. I was a different person then, a young man in an impossible situation doing what needed to be done. That's not who I am now. Now, I'm just Harold Martinez, your neighbor on Maple Street, and that's enough for me. Harold paused, looking out at the sea of faces, many of them people who'd known him for years without really seeing him. But I do want to say this. If this memorial makes you think differently about the veterans in your community, if it makes you wonder about the quiet people you see at the grocery store or the post office or community events, then it's served a good purpose. We're all carrying stories you might not expect. We're all more than we appear to be. Harold's voice grew stronger as he continued. I don't need your apologies for how you treated me before, but I hope that going forward you'll remember that every person deserves basic dignity and respect, whether they're decorated veterans or not, whether they have impressive stories or not, whether they fit into your social circles or not. The crowd was completely absorbed, hanging on every word from this man they'd dismissed and ignored. The real heroism isn't what happened 40 years. I go in a jungle on the other side of the world, Harold said, his voice carrying clearly now across the memorial park. The real heroism is how we treat each other every day, how we include the lonely, how we notice the invisible, how we care for our neighbors regardless of their backgrounds or their bank accounts or their social status. Harold looked directly at Carol Stevens, then at Tom Richardson, then at the other faces he recognized from community events where he'd been overlooked. You want to honor veterans? You want to honor service? Then serve each other. Notice each other. Include each other. That's the memorial that matters most. Harold stepped back from the microphone, his face flushed from the effort and emotion of speaking publicly. The crowd remained silent for several heartbeats, processing not just his words but the grace with which he'd addressed their collective shame. Then the applause began. It started with the uniformed veterans in the front row, then spread throughout the crowd until 300 people were giving Harold Martinez a standing ovation that seemed to last forever. But it wasn't just applause for his military service. It was applause for his wisdom, his forgiveness, his gentle rebuke of their behavior, and his challenge to do better. As the applause finally died down, Colonel Harrison returned to the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, you've just heard from a true American hero. Not just because of what he did in combat, but because of how he's lived his life since. Mr. Martinez embodies the values our military fights to protect: humility, service, forgiveness, and an unwavering commitment to the dignity of every person. The formal ceremony concluded with a military honor guard presenting Harold with a folded American flag and a framed copy of his service record. Local veterans organizations lined up to shake his hand and invite him to their meetings. Neighbors who'd ignored him for years waited patiently for a chance to speak with him personally. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when young Danny Patterson, an 8-year-old boy Harold recognized from the community barbecue, approached with his parents. Mr. Martinez, the boy said, my dad says you're a real hero. Can I shake your hand? Harold knelt down to the boy's level, his weathered face breaking into the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him all day. You can shake my hand, he said gently, but I want you to remember that heroes come in all kinds of packages. Your teachers are heroes, your parents are heroes, the police officers and firefighters in our community are heroes. Being a hero isn't about medals or monuments, it's about caring for others. The boy nodded solemnly and shook Harold's hand with both of his small ones. I want to be a hero like you, he said. You already are, Harold replied. You just don't know it yet. As the crowd began to disperse, Harold found himself surrounded by neighbors who wanted to talk, to apologize, to invite him to dinner, to include him in upcoming community events. The transformation was remarkable and overwhelming. In the space of a single ceremony, Harold Martinez had gone from invisible to celebrated, from ignored to honored, from lonely to surrounded by people who wanted to be part of his life. But even as Harold graciously accepted dinner invitations and promises to visit, he couldn't help wondering if this attention would last, or if it was just the temporary result of shock and guilt that would fade as the memory of the memorial dedication grew distant. The weeks following the memorial dedication brought changes to Harold's life that he could never have imagined. His phone rang constantly with invitations to speak at veterans events, to attend community functions, to participate in local government meetings. The Riverside Community Center asked him to serve on their board of directors. The local VFW post elected him to honorary membership. 3 different veterans organizations offered to nominate him for state and national recognition. But the most meaningful changes were smaller and more personal. Tom Richardson stopped by regularly, often bringing coffee and genuine conversation. About Harold's experiences and perspectives, Carol Stevens organized a neighborhood book club and insisted that Harold be their first member. The successful retirees who'd once excluded him from their conversations now actively sought his opinions and company. Harold's house on Maple Street, once isolated and quiet, became a regular gathering place for neighbors who'd previously never acknowledged his existence. His small front porch, where he'd sat alone for years, now hosted impromptu conversations with people walking by who wanted to chat with their newly discovered hero. The changes weren't without complications. Harold sometimes felt overwhelmed by the attention, missing the solitude he'd grown accustomed to over the years. The constant invitations and obligations, while well-meaning, sometimes felt more burdensome than celebratory. He worried that people were interested in him only because of his military record, not because of who he was as a person. But there were undeniably positive aspects to his newfound visibility. Harold discovered that he enjoyed sharing his experiences with younger veterans who were struggling with their own transitions to civilian life. His wisdom and perspective, gained through decades of quiet reflection, proved valuable to men and women facing challenges similar to what he'd experienced years earlier. The memorial itself became a gathering place for the community in ways that surprised everyone. Families began bringing their children to visit, using Harold's story as a teaching moment about service and sacrifice. Local schools organized field trips to the memorial, with Harold occasionally serving as a volunteer guide, sharing not just his military experiences but his perspectives on citizenship, community, and the importance of noticing and caring for others. 6 months after the dedication, Harold was invited to speak at the high school's Veterans Day Assembly. Standing before 200 teenagers, many of them the same age he'd been when he'd enlisted, Harold found himself thinking about the cycles of service and sacrifice that connected generations. "When I was your age," he told the students, "I thought heroism was something dramatic and obvious, something that happened in movies or history books. I never imagined that real heroism was mostly quiet, mostly invisible, mostly about small daily choices to care for others even when no one is watching." A student raised her hand. "Mr. Martinez, do you think what you did in Vietnam made you a hero? Or do you think you were already a hero before that?" Harold considered the question carefully. "I think heroism isn't something you are or aren't. I think it's something you choose again and again in small moments and big ones. The teenagers who include lonely classmates in their lunch table are heroes. The students who stand up to bullying are heroes. The young people who volunteer at nursing homes or help their neighbors are heroes." Another student asked, "Why did you stay quiet about your military service for so long?" "Because I thought it didn't matter anymore," Harold replied honestly. "I thought it was ancient history, irrelevant to who I was as an older man. What I learned from the memorial dedication is that our stories matter, not because they make us special, but because they connect us to each other. Everyone has stories worth telling and worth hearing." The assembly concluded with students lining up to shake Harold's hand and ask for autographs, treating him like the celebrity he'd never wanted to become. But what struck Harold most was their genuine interest in his message about everyday heroism, about the importance of noticing and including others. As Harold walked home from the high school that afternoon, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since that day at the community barbecue when he'd sat alone by the garbage, invisible to his own neighbors. The transformation wasn't just in how others treated him, but in how he saw himself and his role in the community. He thought about Maria, his late wife, and how proud she would have been to see him finally receiving the recognition she'd always believed he deserved. But more than that, she would have been proud to see him using that recognition to teach others about compassion and inclusion. Harold's small house on Maple Street came into view, and he could see Tom Richardson sitting on the front porch steps, waiting with 2 cups of coffee and what appeared to be a manila envelope. "How did the school visit go?" Tom asked as Harold approached. "Better than I expected," Harold replied, accepting the offered coffee gratefully. "These kids give me hope. They understand things that took me decades to figure out." Tom nodded, then held up the envelope. This came to my house by mistake. It's addressed to you, from the Department of Veterans Affairs. Harold opened the envelope carefully, scanning the official letterhead and formal language. His expression grew serious as he read. "What is it?" Tom asked. "They want to nominate me for induction into the State Veterans Hall of Fame," Harold said quietly. "Apparently someone submitted my name and service record." Tom's face broke into a wide grin. "Harold, that's incredible. You absolutely deserve that recognition." Harold folded the letter carefully. "I don't know. All this attention, all these honors. Sometimes I wonder if I'm becoming exactly what I never wanted to be, someone who defines himself by things that happened 50 years ago. Is that really what you think you're doing?" Tom asked gently. Harold considered the question while sipping his coffee. Over the past months, he'd watched his community change, not just in how they treated him, but in how they treated each other. The memorial had sparked conversations about inclusion and recognition that extended far beyond veterans' issues. Neighbors were making more effort to connect with elderly residents, to include newcomers, to notice the quiet people who might otherwise be overlooked. "No," Harold said finally. "I think what's happening is bigger than just my story. I think people needed to be reminded that heroism looks different than they expected, that the people they see every day might be carrying experiences and wisdom they never imagined." A year after the memorial dedication, the annual Riverside Community BBQ returned to the same park where Harold had once sat alone by the garbage. But this year's event looked dramatically different. Harold arrived to find a reserved table near the main pavilion with a handmade sign reading "Honorary Guest Harold Martinez." The setup included comfortable chairs, a proper table setting, and a small American flag centerpiece. Carol Stevens approached immediately, her warmth genuine and unforced. "Harold, we're so glad you're here. Can I get you a plate? We made sure to have your favorites." Harold looked around the familiar park, remembering his isolation from the previous year. Now families waved to him from across the lot. Children ran up to hug him, and the successful retirees who'd once excluded him were eagerly making space for him in their conversations. But what struck Harold most was noticing the other quiet people at the edges of the gathering. An elderly woman sitting alone near the playground, a middle-aged man who appeared to know no one, picking at his food in solitude, a young mother with small children who looked overwhelmed and isolated. "Excuse me for a moment," Harold said to Carol, and walked toward the elderly woman by the playground. "Would you like to join us at our table?" he asked gently. "There's plenty of room, and I'd enjoy the company." The woman's face lit up with surprise and gratitude. "Are you sure? I don't want to impose." "I'm absolutely sure," Harold replied. "I know what it feels like to be alone at these things." Harold spent the afternoon moving between the isolated individuals at the barbecue, extending invitations, making introductions, ensuring that no one experienced the loneliness he'd felt the year before. He'd become not just the community's honored veteran, but its unofficial ambassador of inclusion. As the sun began to set and families started packing up, Tom Richardson approached Harold with a satisfied smile. "You know what I noticed today?" "What's that?" "Nobody was sitting alone. Nobody was ignored. You've changed more than just how people treat you, Harold. You've changed how people treat each other." Harold looked around the park, seeing the evidence of Tom's observation. Conversations between people who'd never spoken before. Elderly residents surrounded by younger families. Newcomers being welcomed and included. The community barbecue had become what it was always supposed to be. A true gathering of neighbors caring for each other. The transformation of Riverside's community culture became Harold's most lasting legacy, more significant than any military decoration or bronze monument. His story had reminded people that heroism wasn't just about dramatic moments of courage, but about the daily choice to notice, include, and care for others. As Harold walked home that evening, past the memorial that bore his face and his story, he reflected on the journey from invisibility to recognition to something more meaningful. The opportunity to help others avoid the loneliness he'd experienced, to ensure that no neighbor would ever again sit alone by the garbage at their own community's celebration. The memorial dedicated to Harold Martinez honored his military service, But Harold's real monument was the transformed community around him, where quiet heroes were noticed, where lonely neighbors were included, and where every person's dignity was recognized and protected. 3 years after the memorial dedication, Harold Martinez was invited to speak at the National Veterans Day ceremony in Washington, D.C. Standing before thousands of people, including military leaders, government officials, and fellow veterans from across the country, Harold delivered a message that would be remembered long after the formal ceremonies ended. "When I enlisted in 1965, he said, I thought I was serving my country by carrying a rifle and following orders. What I learned over the next 50 years is that serving your country never ends. It continues every day when you choose to serve your neighbors, your community, and especially the people who feel invisible." Harold's voice carried clearly across the National Mall as he continued. "We talk about honoring veterans, and that's important. But the best way to honor any veteran is to live the values we fought to protect. Dignity, inclusion, compassion, and the fundamental belief that every person matters." He paused, looking out at the massive crowd, thinking about his journey from the forgotten man sitting alone at a community barbecue to this moment on the national stage. "I want to challenge everyone here today, veterans and civilians alike, to go home and look for the quiet heroes in your own communities. Look for the people sitting alone, the neighbors you've never spoken to, the elderly residents who might be invisible despite living right next door. That's where real heroism happens, not in monuments or ceremonies, but in daily acts of recognition and inclusion." The speech was broadcast nationally and shared millions of times on social media. But for Harold, the most meaningful response came from a letter he received a few weeks later from a young teacher in Ohio. "Mr. Martinez," she wrote, "after hearing your speech, I started a program at my school called Quiet Heroes. Students nominate classmates who show everyday heroism through kindness, inclusion, and helping others. We've discovered so many wonderful stories of young people caring for each other that we never would have noticed before. Thank you for reminding us that heroism is all around us if we just pay attention." Similar programs began appearing in communities across the country, all inspired by Harold's message about noticing and honoring the heroism that exists in ordinary moments between ordinary people. Harold Martinez lived for another 8 years, after the memorial dedication, passing away peacefully at age 86 in the small house on Maple Street where he'd spent 43 years. His funeral filled the largest church in Riverside, with attendees including local families, fellow veterans, government officials, and hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by his message of inclusion and recognition. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came during the funeral service when Carol Stevens stood to speak about Harold's impact on their community. "Harold Martinez taught us that heroism isn't about being seen," she said. "It's about seeing others. He showed us that the medals and monuments are nice, but the real measure of a hero is how many people they refuse to let remain invisible." The memorial bearing Harold's face still stands in Riverside's downtown park, visited daily by residents and tourists who come to learn about the decorated veteran who lived quietly among his neighbors for decades before his heroism was discovered. But Harold's true memorial is the transformed community around that bronze monument, where neighbors notice each other, where lonely people are included, and where quiet heroes are recognized and celebrated every single day. Today, as you go about your daily life, surrounded by people whose stories you don't know and whose struggles you can't see, remember Harold Martinez. Remember that heroism often walks among us unrecognized, that dignity doesn't depend on achievements or recognition, and that the most powerful way to honor any hero is to become one yourself through simple acts of noticing, including, and caring for others. Take a moment to look around your own community. Who's sitting alone? Who's been overlooked? Who might be carrying stories of service, sacrifice, or quiet courage that no one has bothered to discover? The next time you see someone who seems invisible, remember that they might be exactly the kind of hero Harold Martinez was. Extraordinary people living ordinary lives, waiting for someone to simply notice their humanity and treat them with the dignity every person deserves. Leave a comment below about a quiet hero in your own life, someone whose story deserves to be told, whose service deserves recognition, or whose simple presence makes your community better. Because in the end, that's how we truly honor veterans like Harold Martinez, by ensuring that no one in our communities ever has to sit alone by the garbage, invisible and forgotten, while carrying the weight of heroism that no one has bothered to see.